Hello everyone. Welcome back to APUSH. Today we're going to be looking at Key Concept 8.2.2, Effects of the Civil Rights Movement. Now to kind of set this one up, our previous lecture was all just about the African American Civil Rights Movement and its entire narrative throughout the mid-20th century. What we're looking at here is not so much like, effect by effect, but how the African American Civil Rights Movement inspired other groups to also fight for their rights. And also inspired other movements that weren't always focused on rights, but were focused on sort of a grassroots movement aimed at kind of fixing social problems through direct action, as the Civil Rights Movement demonstrated very well. So here we go. We've got a few of them to look at. Oops, that didn't work. There we are. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is feminism and gay rights. So let's kind of set up where women were first coming out of World War II. Now we've studied women's history sort of all across U.S. history, and the term I often use here is anytime there were steps forward, they were baby steps. So if we look at going all the way back to Republican motherhood, it was something that sure, it might have made women feel like they were more involved, but they still had zero political rights. Later on, voluntary organizations made them have an ability to be more socially involved, but still no political rights. As we get into the 20th century, we do get women gaining political rights through things like the 19th Amendment and other laws. And during World War II, there is some idea of economic opportunities through wartime industries. But after World War II ends, the expectation is that women are supposed to return to the home and reassume their role within that cult of domesticity. Okay? So during the 1950s and onward and through about the 1960s, we see that some women are working outside the home, but they're still in these traditional female jobs. So working as clerks, working as secretaries, not in positions of leadership. So there still is this kind of hierarchy set up between the sexes where women are at a secondary level. Now, some women, when they went into this post-World War II era, they liked it. Okay, they thought kind of after World War II, much after World War I, there was this push for a return to normalcy of not really being so concerned about the world, not being so concerned about things outside your own lives, but by developing your family. So women were happy to get married and have children, but as time went on and getting into the 1960s, it became apparent to women who were talking to each other that dissatisfaction was rampant, that many of them felt suppressed and limited and subjugated to some extent by this ideal image set forth by society, that they felt it was a standard that they could never meet no matter how hard they tried, and they thought about what were they sacrificing by trying to conform to that image. And that's going to lead to a growing feminist movement that starts with things such as The Feminine Mystique by an author and journalist named Betty Friedan. There's Betty Friedan on the far right in the middle picture right there. Now what she did is, you have to understand her background is, she was one of these happy housewives. Her husband got home from World War II, they bought a house, they got married, they had a few kids, and she was at home cooking and cleaning and, packing lunches and going to baseball games and all these things associated with kind of that 1950s image of the nuclear family. But over time, she started to think, what am I sacrificing by doing this? She was a freelance journalist as well. She wrote kind of articles for women's magazines on the side. And one time, she wrote an article that was much more serious, and it got rejected by all the newspapers or the magazines. They said, "Why are you writing this? We want your, reviews of dishwashers and things like that." And she said, "Wait, am I not allowed to have a serious voice in society?" And she started to question things. And she talked to other women and discovered that her questioning was not her. It was all throughout women across the country. So she wrote this book, The Feminine Mystique, about that 1950s image and how it was not fair, it was not right, and women had so much more potential than what society was telling them to do. So with other women leaders, she helped to create NOW, so the National Organization for Women, to promote women's issues. So this exists into the 1960s, 70s, up till now. But the way that you can think about this organization, it's much like how the NAACP was working to lobby for more rights and more issues on behalf of African Americans. We see that this organization works to pressure Congress to pass laws that favor greater political, social, economic equality for women. So you see that this kind of ties in with other things dealing with the civil rights movement, the need to sort of get people at a grassroots level, this kind of like everyday person, to realize they have similar problems, and then they can organize to fight together. Okay? Eventually, things like now would lead to acts of Congress. One was the Equal Pay Act in 1963. So this was a push to make it legalized that women had to get equal pay to men for equal work. So this did get passed, and it was evident in some industries, but we know till today that there still is the pay gap between men and women in positions of power. I think it's, what is it, it's about 77 cents on the dollar or so. So we see that, yes, this was a step forward, but it didn't fix everything. Much like with when we studied the Civil Rights Movement before. Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965 were steps forward, but they didn't fix all the problems. Another thing that increased women's rights was something called Title IX, passed in 1972. It was part of another Civil Rights Act got passed then. The thing that this is most associated with is public accommodations being equal in funding for men and women. So this often applies to schools when we think about what funding is available for extracurriculars like sports. So that's why our school has trouble adding new sports, because if you add a girls' sport, you have to add a boys' sport to make sure that it's that there's equality and equity between things being offered when public money is involved. All right, so this is the beginning of the women's rights movement. So in the 1950s into the 1960s, we're going to talk about this again later on in this historical period and see how it evolves even more. Now, something else that has to do with kind of these sort of sexual awakenings and also rights issues has to do with the gay rights movement. Now, what you need to know about this issue is that kind of what gay history is like up till this point. Even up through the 1960s, states had laws in place that found ways to persecute gay people. So some of these were called sodomy laws that made it illegal to have gay sex. Other stuff involved the police basically trying to entrap gay men by posing as other gay men at bars and basically trying to solicit sex and then being able to arrest them as a result. So this was very common. It was not socially acceptable or even politically warrantable in many cases to be publicly out, so to speak. What we get in the 1960s, though, is much like with these other rights movements, these social standards start to be challenged. Okay? When we get into the same era with the 1960s, gay people were often moving into cities where there were known areas where they sort of felt safer in their kind of enclaves. So if you remember when we talked about immigrants before, they often moved to cities where other immigrants were already living. And this is the same thing that happened to gay people in the mid-20th century, is that they would move to cities where they knew that it might be more socially acceptable and that there were other people similar to them that they could live around and associate with and feel more like themselves. One of these major places was Greenwich Village in New York City. So realize this is going also in line with the shift from rural populations moving into urban centers. Now, in New York City, like I mentioned before, those kind of sting operations, there were shakedowns of gay bars and known establishments that catered to the gay community by the New York City police. And eventually this led to riots at one of the major centers called the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village. It was a known place. It didn't say like, it's not like today where there's the rainbow flag, where, there's ways to tell about sort of, who different areas are catering to and whether, they're sort of, promoting pride and all that. It was kind of a known gay bar, but also very secret at the same time. So the police would come in and just kind of shake down the place, find reasons to shut them down, saying, oh, look, we found this this health violation, you're shut down. But it wasn't so much that they were searching for that, they were searching for a reason to shut down a gay establishment. Eventually, this led to riots, okay? The gay community came out sort of full-fledged in the numbers that existed in the small area. And for a few weeks, there were riots within that area of the city, marches, protesting to basically make the point to saying, we're here, this is our area, and we have rights too, that we're going to start to sort of unite so that you can't abuse us the way you've been abusing this. Now, something to know. This was a step forward, a way to sort of organize, just like I talked about other organizations forming to promote certain groups' civil rights. The harassment didn't really end, social views didn't change, but this was sort of a landmark moment where the gay right groups started to come together and organize, okay? And you can see here, like I put, the first sort of pride event in New York City was made to commemorate these riots that are kind of this milestone in the history of gay rights. All right, next groups that we're talking about are sort of other races in America, marginalized groups that were fighting for their rights, that looked at the African American civil rights movement and said, hey, we're facing some of these same problems. We should join this movement and fight for our rights in the same way that blacks, especially in the South, were fighting for theirs. One of these major groups was Latinos and what they were fighting for. To know this, we have to go all the way back to a landmark case within the California Supreme Court. Now, this Mendez versus Westminster case actually inspired Brown versus Board of Education, and the same logic and jurisprudence, so kind of the set of laws, would be used to challenge segregation nationwide. Now, what this was is that there was a Chicano family living up in Westminster, which is in Orange County. And actually, it's contextualized with Japanese American internment as well. So a Japanese family was being sent off to the camps, and they rented their farm to the Mendez family. So it was kind of an extended family, I think a couple brothers or a couple sisters and their kids. They moved there and they said, okay, we have to figure out where are we going to send our kids. So they went to the most local school, and the school said, well, those kids can go here, but those kids can't. And they were like, wait, we're all part of the same family. What does it matter? Well, some of the kids were more light complexioned than some of the other kids, so they said the white kids, they're the kids that look white, can go here, but the kids that have darker skin need to go to the Mexican school across town. And the family was like, but wait, we live in the same place, we're the same exact family. Just from a sort of convenience thing, it's not good for us to send them to multiple schools. And the school said, well, tough, this is what we're doing. So they challenged it in the California Supreme Court, and because of it, California schools were desegregated. Okay, and you can see how that ties in with this major Supreme Court case you need to know. Now, a couple major leaders within the Latino civil rights community were Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. So they were both working for the United Farm Workers. So this was an attempt to unionize basically manual farm workers all across the state. And they were saying that they really didn't have a say in what their pay or working conditions were. Their working conditions were horrible on these farms, where they didn't have proper places to even go to the bathroom. They weren't given lunch breaks. They weren't given these things that we expect even manual labor to have access to. And if you look at industrial sectors, many of those groups had certain workplace rights because of the progressive movement and because of labor unions, and farm workers are being prevented from unionizing. So what happened? These major leaders organized a grape boycott. So much of the organization, especially when you get up into Northern California, has to do with the grape industry. So what they said is, we're not going to work anymore, and we're going to use our power to try and get people to boycott buying grapes. Okay? So it seems like it's very focused on one thing, but it was also very successful in the way that it pressured the big growers to actually negotiate with the United Farm Workers. They also had a march, much in the same way that marches were a part of the African American civil rights movement. The largest march they had was from Los Angeles to Sacramento, all through the Central Valley, where most of the people that were protesting lived and worked. The idea of going from a major urban center to the state capital through the area that could rally a lot of people got a lot of public notice, a lot of public pressure. Cesar Chavez also went on a hunger strike during this in order to show his commitment to the cause. What it resulted in was a wage raise in 1970 for the farm workers. So it's one of those issues where, yes, it did make some stuff happen, but it didn't fix racism. It didn't fix all of the issues that Latinos were facing in California, because this was really just a California-specific movement. All right, one last group associated with the Latino civil rights movement were called the Young Lords. I'm putting them here as a way of sort of drawing these connections between the civil rights movement proper that we studied before and these new movements that develop from being influenced by it. The Young Lords are comparable to how the Black Panthers evolved out of the African American civil rights movement. So the Young Lords were Puerto Rican nationalists. During this era, there are more people of Puerto Rican descent living in New York City than Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico. So they had a large demographic presence and felt, much like these other groups, that they were not being afforded their rights in society. But they also felt that there wasn't really a way forward to go through the legal system. So, much like there's Black nationalism, there's nationalism within Puerto Rican communities, much like the Black Panthers. All right, so next up, Native American civil rights. So, of course, this is one of the most marginalized groups across our history. The last time we talked about them, we talked about the massacre at Wounded Knee and how this was kind of the end of the Indian Wars, and it instituted a new policy of assimilation, Americanization, in which most American Indian tribes, were really stripped of their agency and stripped of their culture to be forced to adapt to mainstream white society. But as you can expect, much as these other marginalized groups are finding ways of rising up and sort of challenging the status quo, this happens with the Native Americans as well. The name of the big movement here was the American Indian Movement, often abbreviated AIM, and it formed in 1968. Notice kind of towards the end of the civil rights movement for African Americans as we've studied it. What they were looking for, sovereignty on their land, on their reservations, and they wanted to change federal laws that existed that had limited their rights. So there were passed laws that said all natives are wards of the American government. And they're looking at these policies saying, well, we have rights, and reasonably speaking, we were here first. We deserve these rights just as much as anyone else. Right? So some things they did in order to get their point across: they occupied the Pine Ridge Reservation, which, if you remember, is the place where the Wounded Knee Massacre happened. So it's kind of ground zero for Native issues across history. Alcatraz, they also tried to take over Alcatraz Island, which you see on the bottom right there. That's an island sort of in San Francisco Bay, and they were trying to get across the point of how much of Native American land was bought from their tribes for basically nothing. So what they did is they occupied it and said, here, we'll give you some beads in order to buy it back. They were trying to make a point, but it also marked the beginning point of a march for their organization as well, going from San Francisco all the way to Washington, D.C. in order to get public pressure on Congress and visibility for their rights issues just as much. This was called the Longest Walk. So they tried to visit a lot of reservations along the way, places of Native American history, to show the connection between their rights movement with their own their past. Some major organizers: Russell Means, Leonard Pelletier, among others. Now, what came of this? So changing in tribal laws, which gave tribes more autonomy on tribal land. What that means is that's why, like in California, how it's only on Native American reservations where we really have casinos, because they're not subject to state and federal law regarding those. They also face different taxation laws, different kind of local authorities, so the feds and the state police can't really go onto reservations without permission because they have their own law enforcement agencies. All right? So, next up, this should be kind of a quick one because we're kind of setting it up here, but going to talk about it later on. So what happens is a movement against poverty starts to develop during the 1960s out of the civil rights movement as well. So let's contextualize this a bit. All right, so after World War II, we had extreme economic growth. Here's just a couple statistics so you know. Politically, we were a superpower, and that meant with a military-industrial complex, we were competing to have the most number of weapons, to be the most powerful and strongest economy in the world. So there was this pressure to do it. sort of foreign conflicts like the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and liberalism saw much more government spending, and that contributed to government growth. Just talked about the military-industrial complex before, made the private sector, so kind of private businesses were able to grow more. And some data on that, GDP grew from $200 billion to $500 billion in 15 years. And what this meant is we did see a rise of the middle class. However, poverty didn't end, and let's look at some statistics about that. So 50 million Americans in the early 1960s were still living in poverty. It's about 1 in 4 of people lived in poverty. Part of this had to do with farmers and the mechanization of labor. They were not growing, they were not expanding as other industries were. And so what all these issues led to was because government at the time was willing to interfere and get involved, there was a push for more government programs to address the issue of poverty. So Harry Truman had I'll put him here, his Fair Deal program, JFK had his New Frontier, LBJ had the Great Society. So we see them trying to implement these to address poverty, much in the same way that the New Deal tried to fix the Great Depression. We're going to talk about this idea of the war on poverty later on when we study Cold War liberalism specifically. I just want to set up here that there are movements growing against it, even from just journalists and authors as well, because they look at things like the Civil Rights Movement and say it's not just about political rights, it's about social justice. And while the Civil Rights Movement, especially for African Americans, addressed political rights, it did not change social views or economic opportunities to a great level. So what some people are saying is that the government should be used to address poverty as a national problem, and trying to fix it as a whole. All right, our last slide here. One last movement that developed as a result of the Civil Rights Movement has to do with environmentalism. So this one seems kind of like an outlier, right? Other ones, you could see the relation of groups of people feeling marginalized and the government and grassroots organizations trying to address it to alleviate the symptoms of inequality in society. Environmentalism, it's like, how did this get here? I'll relate it back to the bigger ideas in just a minute. But remember, this is not a new thing that we're talking about. We have talked about the debates over preservation and conservation before. Preservation is, of course, the desire to protect nature for nature's sake, while conservation is protecting natural resources to not deplete them. Conservation is the more moderate stance, the idea of, well, we need to not use everything up now, so to provide some for future generations, while preservation is kind of the more radical stance of saying, just don't touch it, it's not ours to touch. And what these ideas bring up is a central question about government. To what extent should government regulate business practices? And depends on where you are on the political spectrum that decides whether you think there should be more laissez-faire capitalism or more government intervention to prevent negative externalities put on by businesses. And it's within this context, the 60s and the 70s, where there's a bigger push for regulation because of decades of no regulation. Anytime the pendulum swings too far one way, it's going to start to swing the other way as a reaction. Okay? Part of the environmentalist movement was triggered by a book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring. Now, what she was writing about specifically was the use of pesticides on food. Okay, the biggest one she was criticizing was DDT, and here's what she's trying to say. This kind of ties back into when we read The Jungle, all the way back in period 6 or period 7, I can't perfectly remember. But if you remember, we talked about how bad sort of food standards were. And I can't forget if I showed it to you in class, but online you can look up the food standards to see how many insect particles and larvae and fungus is allowed in your food before it's sent out to the public to be able to consume and buy. As a reaction of trying to limit sort of what natural sort of contaminations are in your food, many companies and farmers started to use pesticides to kill off all the pests and let the plants grow on their own. Seems like a great idea on the surface, but the unintended consequences, a negative externality, that's an economics term for a bad thing that happens, is that those chemicals could then start to give people cancer and give people diseases. And the government has to decide to what extent is it going to allow pesticides to prevent natural contamination, but to what extent is it going to limit pesticides to make sure that there's not this synthetic contamination that can lead to diseases. Okay? Now, because of her book and its popularity, DDT got banned in agriculture, and there's more lobbying for environmentalist concerns as a result. This, much like anything when we talk about civil rights, it had to influence the federal government to be effective, and this is how it ties in of a grassroots organization, an issue, telling the federal government, you need to do this thing that is negatively affecting people. Okay? Richard Nixon signs the Environmental Protection Agency into law in 1970. Yes, Richard Nixon, he's the one. And what it was going to do is regulate the impact of business on the government. This is part of the Clean Air Act that could limit the emissions of companies and put fines on them if they exceeded their carbon emissions. So the reason I kind of pointed out that Nixon thing is Nixon is a Republican. And if we think about that central question of government, typically Republicans are on the side of laissez-faire capitalism, of not limiting business practices. But this is the time period when the parties weren't so polarized. They were much more moderate. Nixon, for everything he's known for with Watergate and all that, he was a moderate Republican who said, I want to appeal to what we need to get things done, and that's why he let the EPA happen. Okay? Now, on top of this, there were environmental disasters that made people question those lack of regulations before. Two major ones that we could talk about are the 3 Mile Island disaster and the Love Canal disaster. Now, 3 Mile Island was a nuclear power plant that started to melt down in Pennsylvania, and it revealed to us that we could use nuclear energy as an alternative to fossil fuels, but it had these potential huge negative externalities through nuclear waste and contamination of nature. Now, Love Canal was a place, it was sort of along this river near Niagara Falls, and it was the place where a lot of companies' sort of contamination, pollution, and runoff all collected. And what happened is all the kids in that neighborhood started getting cancers, I think leukemia specifically, and they started dying off. And they were trying to figure out, and they eventually tested sort of the well water and the runoff water and found unprecedented amounts of this. It led to things so extreme that the parents involved called in the business owners and the factory owners to negotiate what to do, and they held them hostage until they agreed to what they wanted to do. What this reveals is that environmental disasters and pollution was becoming an issue that people cared about once it started to affect them, and once people start to complain about something is when the government gets involved. And that really ties this in to the civil rights movement, this idea of in order to get things done, the people need to sort of protest and make things happen, and the government has to be pressured enough to respond with things that are going to quell the people's concerns. Okay? That's a major theme here of grassroots organizations, people having concerns, addressing the government, and pressuring the government enough to force them to do something when they were unwilling to do stuff in the past. Alright, thank you so much for watching as always. You know what you've got to do. You've got some cards to create, a quiz to take, geography to work on, chronology to study, and always another video to watch. So this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in class. Bye.